Hey you guys, this is Jasmine. We're going to go over our lecture for chapter 5 and 6 of the NSCA CPT textbook, and we're going to just dive right in. I want to remind you that this lecture is supposed to complement our readings of chapter 5 and 6 and our doings of the quizzes. So just make sure that you're reading your chapters, and we're pretty much going to highlight the most important parts of each chapter in this video. So let's get into training adaptations. So most of us know what training adaptations, would mean or could mean, but pretty basically, training adaptations is what's going to happen to my body once I start a workout program. So let's find out. So some changes that can happen to our body structure: muscles will change for sure. They can get stronger, they can last longer, etc. Tendons, ligaments, bone and cartilage, adipose tissue, so our body composition, the fat that we have on our body will definitely change. Some body systems that can change as well are neuromuscular, cardiorespiratory, metabolic, endocrine, which is hormones, and then psychological, which is way up there in our brain. So causes of adaptations that we're talking about today: resistance training, and then we're going to talk about aerobic endurance training. There's two types of adaptations, so please just remember that there's acute and chronic adaptations. Acute's going to occur shortly after exercise. Chronic is going to occur after repeated training bouts and persist long after the training session. So we're going to talk about some more specific examples in a little bit. Sweet. All right, moving right along. Physiological changes that can happen are neural. So that's in the first 6 to 10 weeks of training. That's your brain. Your brain is changing first. So I feel like this question comes up quite a bit, whether it's in a quiz or in the actual test. They'll ask, for a resistance training program, what is the changes that happen in the first 5 to 10 weeks or something like that. So just remember that neural changes are going to happen first. Then we have muscular and connective tissues, and that's after about 10 weeks. So that's about 2 months, so it's definitely a time difference. So just be aware of that. And then metabolic adaptations will consist of phosphagen system and glycolytic system, and that's not going to drastically change per se, but we're going to be able to use those systems more efficiently. So some acute adaptations is, let's go right back into neurological. We're going to be able to recruit more muscles, which is going to give us an increase in force production. And then I'm going to be able to fire up the muscles that I've recruited faster, and then maybe as well increase my synchronization of firing those muscles, or a combination of all those above can happen, depending on what I'm training. Some muscular changes that can happen, this is acutely, so this is like during the session or after the session. Muscle fatigue, of course, so we get tired when we're working out. Accumulation of metabolites, so metabolites, hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphates, and ammonia. And then we are going to deplete our creatine phosphate as we're working out, which will eventually decrease our power production. And then our glycogen levels will also decrease. Some endocrine changes that are very acute is we'll get an increased hormone concentration of epinephrine and an increased hormone concentration of testosterone, growth hormone. So please just maybe make a star by this slide or make a little note that an increase in epinephrine, an increase in testosterone and growth hormone is an acute adaptation to resistance training. It's very dependent, however, on our training program, right? So our training program, in order to increase these endocrine changes, it better include large muscle groups, high volume, short rest periods. And then it's also going to depend on the gender and age of the individual training. What, did I skip any? Perfect. Okay, cool. So these are chronic adaptations. Again, chronic adaptations is going to happen and last a little bit longer. So neurological changes, first 6 to 10 weeks, we're gonna have an improvement in skill. And that's pretty much a result of an improvement of all the other points. So an increased activation of high threshold motor units, an increased motor unit firing rate, a decreased co-contraction, an increased neuron excitability, and increased synchronization of motor units. Some muscular changes that can happen are hypertrophy. So we have an increased cross-sectional area and volume of the muscle. Hyperplasia, there is some new studies going on about this. So we're just going to go off of this slide and the book that we're currently using. So hyperplasia, fiber size changes, fiber type transitions, and then we have structural and architectural changes as well. So remember that hypertrophy, hyperplasia are chronic adaptations to resistance training. This is a nice little graph kind of depicting our chronic adaptations. So we have neural, kind of tapers off, hypertrophy, we have strength, and strength tapers off. So all of these taper off. And at the very top, you have an individual using steroids, which is no bueno. So this is just a nice little graph, or progress over time. Okay, cool, moving right along. Other adaptations that can happen is we get stronger bones, depending on how we're training, connective tissue strength, increased muscle endurance. This is due to increased total volume of creatine phosphate, glycolytic substrates, and enzymes, increased endocrine response, and then body composition changes. So remember all the things in blue, chronic adaptations to resistance training. You guys, I just want to mention as well, this is my first video, so don't be hating. All right, so we're going to talk about overtraining symptoms. I really want you to go in your book and look up the definition of overreaching and overtraining, because I feel like that definitely comes up in the test. It'll try to trick you a little bit. So these are symptoms of overtraining: hitting a plateau, a decrease in strength, an increase in muscle soreness, sleep disturbances, a decrease in lean body mass, a decrease in appetite, and the loss of interest and mood changes. So just look at the picture and know that we're going to work out, right? We can overreach, and that can either lead to an improvement of physical performance, so I'm getting stronger, or it can lead to overtraining. So I really want you to go and look at that in your book if you're not familiar with that. Moving right along. So detraining and retraining. Let's look at these terms. I want you to know cessation is just a reversal of training adaptations. Retraining, strength reattainment, so getting back your strength, is very high. And then the extent of detraining is going to depend on the duration of cessation and also the client's training status, history, and genetics. So let's go to the next chapter, which is aerobic training, and see what kind of adaptations can happen. Okay, so let's look at the next chapter, which is adaptations to aerobic training. So if I add an aerobic program to my life or my client's life, what's gonna happen? Now this next graph on this next slide is a little bit cut off, so see if you can pull it up on your Google Drive and just check out that last little bit that we won't get to see. The 1, 2, 3 at the top left is just the acronyms. And let's go over the table. So on the left side, we have the variable. On the second column, we have what is happening to that variable at rest, so at homeostasis. That third column is going to be what is going to happen pretty much like during training. So submaximal exercise is like your training session or anything sub-maximal where you're not going all out. And then that last column is what's going to happen to the variable when I'm doing an all-out effort or maximal exercise. So heart rate will decrease at rest. Remember that we're talking about an aerobic training program adaptations. So it's not just going to happen by itself, but if we add that program, we start training aerobically, our heart rate decreases at rest. It will decrease at submaximal exercise, and it will have no change or just slight decrease at maximal exercise. Stroke volume is going to increase all the way. Cardiac output has no change or slight decrease until maximal exercise. Systolic and diastolic are very similar, and looky here, they're both going to decrease at rest, which is great, and at fixed sub-max exercise. Sorry about that. And then pulmonary ventilation doesn't really change at rest, but at exercise it's going to decrease if it's submaximal, increase if it's maximal. And I think that decrease of pulmonary ventilation at fixed submaximal exercise is really what a lot of people are going for. Other acute responses that can happen, remember acute is short-term respiratory, so we can increase our ventilation by increasing our breathing rate and tidal volume. Metabolically, we can increase our oxygen consumption and our blood lactate. And with our endocrine system, we can increase catecholamines, glucagon, insulin, and growth hormone. Remember that these responses are strongly related to exercise intensity. So there's definitely a difference in acute adaptations if someone has a walking program versus a running program. So some chronic adaptations that can happen, skeletal muscle is minimally affected, but you get enhanced endurance due to an increase of capillary density, mitochondrial density, oxidative enzyme activity, and intramuscular glycogen stores. Whew. Alrighty then. On to the next slide. Some other chronic adaptations that can happen. Remember, we're talking about the aerobic system. Let's talk about metabolic adaptations. We're going to have an enhanced ability to produce ATP, which is way cool. An increased mitochondrial count, increased such and such. Aerobic enzymes, blood supply, and lactate threshold. So at that bottom graph is just the yellow line is the trained individual, and that purple line is untrained individual, and we're talking about blood lactate. You can see that the trained individual has an increased threshold, whereas the detrained, the purple line, their threshold's coming a little bit sooner. Other chronic adaptations I can have is an increase in bone mineral density, so we're going to be able to get stronger bones if we have moderate to high loading forces. So like we're running or we're doing a lot of stairs, we're really loading the bones during our aerobic activity. That's how we're going to get this adaptation. Then we're going to have an increase in strength and stiffness of connective tissues. We're going to have an increase in body composition changes, and that's going to vary with duration and intensity. Go ahead and peek at those 2 bullet points. If we are able to guide our clients to work 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity, we can guide them to a minimal weight loss. If they're working under that, my bad. If they're working over 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity, they're going to get a modest weight loss. Remember, this is a very, very, very general guideline, so you'd want to be a little bit more specific with your actual client. Remember that body composition changes, just peek at those 2 bullet points. And then we will have enhanced insulin sensitivity as well as a chronic adaptation. So concurrent training can be beneficial and it can negatively impact us. So if we are to train endurance training and strength training together, the benefits kind of coincide. So we get neural factors, we have stimulation of type 2A, type 2B fibers, and lactate clearance. And on the other hand, if we're to train for strength and power, which is often, near it's moderate to near maximal effort, and also training aerobically, it can negatively impact us by having adverse neural changes and alterations of muscle proteins. So it's not to say that we can only train one way or with one program, but just to be mindful of how we're recovering and if what we are doing will allow us to hit that overreaching to where we're getting stronger and not overreaching to where we're leading to overtraining. What? Cool. Okay, so let's just define these terms. Overreaching, short-term training without sufficient recuperation that exceeds an individual's capacity. Wow, sorry guys. Okay, let's do that again. Overreaching, short-term training without sufficient recuperation, so without sufficient rest. Just think about that. That exceeds an individual's capacity. Successful recovery can occur within a few days or up to 2 weeks. And this is overtraining. Let's talk about overtraining syndrome. It's a little bit more serious than overreaching, and it results from untrained overreaching and produces long-term impairments in performance and other conditions, so even medical conditions. Overreaching and overtraining can lead to all of these things, and this is not what we want. So we want to make sure that we're recovering our clients, that we're recovering ourselves, we're being good examples, and when we're programming, that we're just very careful with what we're doing. So some training adaptations that can happen psychologically are a decrease of anxiety and depression. We'll have a rhythmic nature of activity, an elevation of serotonin and norepinephrine, forgive me. And then we're gonna have a decreased reactivity to psychological stress, an increased cognition. And that's just to do with memory, analytical thinking, planning, focus, concentration, and decision making, which is all awesome things. Other things that can happen once we start training is we can produce small, moderate reductions in anxiety. So if someone has high anxiety, often exercise will help them reduce that. So if you have a high anxiety client, or maybe you're high anxiety yourself, if you maybe do a workout in the morning or at night before you go to bed, it can really help. The rhythmic, so that next bullet point just says the rhythmic nature of exercise causes a quieting of cognitive activity associated with anxiety and stress. I've heard it explained before too, just from a friend saying that, when you're working out, this is just a simple example, you have to focus on working out, right? And you can't focus on all the other things that are stressing you out. So whether that's helpful to you or not, I don't know. So exercise and depression. Exercise can definitely help with depression because it increases neurotransmitters that are lowered during states of depression. And those neurotransmitters that are increased are going to be serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And that is the end of our slide. Just to recap everything, I would really recommend that you remember the adaptations that are acute and chronic of both resistance and aerobic training. Please leave any questions that you have in the comments or in our current GroupMe that we have. And again, this is just meant to complement our chapters 5 and 6. And I hope that you enjoyed it, and more to come soon. I will see you guys later.